Hello, welcome to the second episode of our Doctor Who retrospective. I'm here with Aaron, I'm Robert, and we're looking today at the second episode, The End of the World, of Series 1 of the 2005 reboot of Doctor Who. So I guess, in the first instance, what's your general...
my general impression, and just for a brief bit of context, I think I have only seen the episode once, and certainly, the last time I watched it was many years ago, possibly up to a decade ago. So I remember very little about it, and it's one of the episodes I remember as a child I thought was quite dull. But as with Rose, I was very pleasantly surprised with this one. It had a lot more going for it than I'd remembered. I enjoyed it the whole way through. I think it's less good than Rose, primarily just because Rose is doing a lot more as a setup episode, and so it's more remarkable for that. But I still thought it was a very strong episode of Doctor Who. How about you, Robert?
So I was, as I briefly mentioned to you before, I was underwhelmed, to be honest. I have seen the episode more recently, so like I said, with Rose, I watched them probably about a year ago. And I just thought, compared to Rose, it really had a lot less kind of drive. I felt like it kind of was meandering about a bit, sort of things just kind of happened and didn't really sort of follow through a really sort of strong core of the episode. I got the impression a little bit that a lot of stuff was happening just because it kind of needed to happen, rather than there being necessarily a huge amount of sort of internal logic to it happening. Particularly in terms of, we'll get on to this, I guess, because it's right at the end of the episode, but I did kind of feel like almost the whole episode seemed a little bit in service of the final scene of the episode. That there were almost sort of things that Davies wanted to introduce to the series and sort of set up. And I was like, how do we fit that into an episode? I think there are some strong aspects of it, and there are some kind of thematically, I think it's got some strengths, but just kind of as an episode to watch, I did find myself at points being a bit kind of bored with the...
Oh, really?
With the main plot of the episode. I thought it had some interesting scenes, and I thought it had some interesting kind of ideas, but and as always with Davies, I thought the characters were very strong. Cassandra is very entertaining as a character, and it's not surprising that she's brought back later on because she is entertaining as a character. But yeah, just kind of plot wise, I thought I'm not that invested in the sort of space station setup itself. I'm sort of tempted almost to not even go into my opinions and just sort of ask you about yours, because I'm. So what do you mean by things happening because they have to? So in terms of, so you've got I think that to me the kind of maybe biggest aspect of that is the final scene, which I do think is a nice scene, the scene with when the Doctor takes Rose back to Earth and kind of brings her back to the present day, and they have that conversation where he reveals for the first time in this series that he's in fact the last of the Time Lords now, and there was a war and Gallifrey's been destroyed, though of course he doesn't mention Gallifrey by name, or indeed the Daleks. But
which, if I can interject quickly, is a very smart choice.
Yes.
It gives you some more information, but doesn't tell you the whole story yet.
Yes, yeah.
It builds effective intrigue.
That I did think was good. Like, it would be very easy just to be kind of like, yeah, it's the Daleks. Remember the Daleks? Oh, it's the Daleks. But it's kind of still...
Or even have a kind of my greatest enemy stares into the middle distance.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, and there is a line to walk with that where you run the risk a little bit of getting into sort of Curse of Fatal Death territory of self-parody. And so in of itself, I thought that scene was good, and I thought there were a lot of scenes in the episode that were kind of by themselves pretty solid. But the kind of it kind of felt to me a little bit like, we need to get the Time War kind of plot off the ground. There was a kind of quite a lot of exposition along those lines in this episode. I felt like, again, done, I suppose, quite well. And like I say, the character work was good. I mean, you had the scene where Rose and the Doctor are in that room just kind of talking, and he gets very kind of defensive about being like, look, who I am right now is who's important. And that works. That,
I think this episode does, because one of my complaints with Rose, one of my very few complaints, was that at the end when he's talking to the nesting consciousness I mentioned, I thought it was a little clunky how he works in the existence of the Time War. I think this episode does a much better job at hinting that there's sort of something going on in the Doctor's past, like you say, when he has the argument with Rose and he sort of gets very agitated that she's asking questions about his past, and then obviously we get more direct exposition later on. So I think certainly with the fact that hang on, sorry, lost my train of thought. Give me a second. Yeah, I think certainly with the fact that now I've seen this episode, that retroactively makes me think that moment in Rose with the nesting was very, very unnecessary. Yes, and you really didn't need that.
And so I think all those things. I mean, this is I feel like this is a slightly strange critique that I'm attempting.
Hold on, there is a dog attempting to enter the room.
Oh, and it has successfully entered the room.
Penny has come to join us again.
Hello.
This is your regularly scheduled dog interlude of our podcast.
Pretty much every time. I feel like I'm attempting a slightly strange critique of this episode in that I did like all of the... Broadly, I liked the kind of character work and the subtlety of getting the Doctor's past and things like that in. I think where it falls down for me as an episode is in the mechanics of the episode more than the the dialogue is great, the character work's great. I just kind of, I think this is kind of exemplified in the giant fans for me. It's just a bit like, how do we contrive to get the Doctor to have a moment where, like the Forest of Cheam woman who I can't remember the name of catches on fire and has a sad moment, and it's like because obviously there's always a certain amount of contrivance in some of the sort of, particularly Doctor Who is very soft sci-fi, as kind of like, look, we just need to sort of service the story. But that I just thought was like, well, why on earth would you have a lever on two sides with three massive fans between them? And I also didn't entirely get what the first lever was for. I thought it slowed down the fans.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah,
but you have to hold it down. But you have to hold it
stay down. Which is not at all how you design a safety system. Maybe this is me as an engineer getting into, but
see, I was thinking about that because that's one of the most common complaints of this episode, is that whole mechanism, specifically with the fans, but also with like, why would you even have sun filters that can be lowered?
Just a button then not raised again.
To be fair, I think the implication was the spiders had messed with the system.
Yeah.
But why not just have sunproof glass? What on earth is the point in having?
Why would you ever want to lower it? Yeah.
Exactly. For me, though, I think with the and I can't tell. I was thinking, am I just like a Russell T Davies shill, or is this just that is my actual opinion? Because I do think it works for two reasons. Firstly, the tone of the stories he writes, particularly one like this, is very campy, sort of action adventure fun. And secondly, he always adequately sets up the specific contrived thing before it becomes plot relevant, which I think goes a long way to making it feel less contrived. Like if the Doctor had been like, oh, the shields are gone, I need to flick the switch, and then you saw the giant fans, I would be much more like, wait, why are those there? But because he walks past it earlier in the episode, it kind of gets in your... Exactly, it's like, it's part of the world. You can stop and think, that makes absolutely no sense. But Russell T Davies, because he's very good with pacing, I find I'm sort of going with the story, so I don't have a moment where I do stop and go, hang on, that makes absolutely no sense. Whereas with like a Chibnall bad, Albert Chibnall story, because the pacing is so bad and there's huge chunks where nothing is happening, that gives you the time to sort of pause and reflect and go, wait, why is that actually the case?
I wonder whether perhaps there is an element of, because I've seen it more recently and therefore am just kind of very familiar with the plot itself, that I was maybe a little bit more detached of being like, because I think I probably have, when I've watched it before, been a bit like, why are there giant fans? But I don't think I've ever been like quite so... I think to me it just felt like it was so absurd that you'd have giant, like, because there is I can't conceive of... I mean, it's, the implication was that they're part of the air conditioning.
Yeah.
Which makes no sense. It just, like, is not how... I mean, I'm not an air conditioning engineer by any stretch, but I don't think that's how air conditioning works. Like, even just kind of basically... and I feel like they could have written a more believable obstacle that even... Like, I feel like I'd even somehow buy like lasers more than I buy giant fans, as like this is a really important sort of security switch because it involves shutting down the whole system, which is risky in some way, and so it has to be protected by a laser security system, sort of Doctor's daughter style thing. I'd almost just, because that would be somehow more overtly sci-fi, that I'd just kind of be like, yeah, okay, I guess it's a bit weird, but giant fans just seem so... And particularly as well because, especially the last fan, so the Doctor needs the fans slowed down. So I'm going on a fan rant now, but the Doctor needs the fans slowed... So actually, backing up a bit, right, so he asks the Forest Sheen person to come with him, knowing that he's going to go to the big fan room, and then is like, oh no, you can't pull the lever because you're made of wood and you'll catch on fire and all the heat will vent in here. Well, presumably he knew that already, that the heat was going to vent in there, because he had a plan.
Did he ask her to come with, or did she just follow?
I'm pretty sure he asked because he was with... There was the three of them, Rose, the Doctor, and her. And she's like, oh, you two go off then. Or is that... No, that's the first time.
That's the first time. The second time, by the time the second time happens, Rose is trapped in that room.
Yes.
And
so actually, yes, she may have...
Yeah, I think she just came with.
Okay. I'll retract that particular criticism then. It's okay, Davies. I'm retracting this criticism. You don't need to worry that I'm going to bring down the entire canon of Doctor Who with my fan critique. But nonetheless, so you have this lever that slows down the fans, and then basically the Forest Sheen person has to risk her life to hold that lever down so that the fans are slow enough that the Doctor can step through them. But then when he gets to the final fan, she catches on fire and releases the lever. And he's able to step through that fan regardless.
Yes, that for me was a step too far. I was like, okay, so you got the giant fans anyway. I'm totally fine with that, 'cause that's kind of nonsense, like a buy. Switches at the other side of the fans. I mean, that makes no practical sense, but it's like, that makes sense for an action-adventure sort of thing. Sure, you have to hold down the lever continually to slow down the fans. Pushing it, but I can still stay with it. And then it's like, oh, and the Doctor could just shut his eyes, go into the zone and step through it. Like, which is not a power the Doctor has. Like, I kind of... But again, it's a... And I consider this a quality of Russell T Davies' writing. I don't consider it lazy writing. He's so good at crafting a scene that draws you in that I didn't actually feel put off in the moment when that happens, because the music is so beautiful and serene, and Eccleston's performance is so good, and it's sort of... It's over quickly enough that it doesn't, like I've said earlier, you don't have enough time to dwell on it and really think about how it doesn't make sense. So it didn't take me out of the episode. I think none of like the illogicality you're mentioning, although I recognise they're there, took me out of the episode. But obviously they are still very logical, and I do think that is a strength of his writing, that even when he does something that doesn't make sense, he still, for me at least, holds your attention and keeps you invested in the story.
I do wonder whether that affects the rewatchability of, say, this episode, because I mean, like I said, you know, I watched it maybe a year ago, and whether that has impacted not getting so invested in the story and therefore kind of being like giant fans, that from the perspective of an episode just airing when it came out, fine, but in terms of I couldn't see myself regularly rewatching this episode.
No, I was about to say, this is not one that I'm desperate to rewatch by any stretch of the imagination. It was perfectly good fun while I was watching it. I was very entertained, but there are moments I really liked, but I don't think it's one I'll be rewatching particularly.
It's the sort of one, again, with the moments, you know, there are definitely some really solid moments in it where you kind of think it's the sort of episode I might engage in on the level of watching clips from it on YouTube.
Yes, I do definitely think that, and again, I don't think that's... The episode is like, it's not like terrible at all. I don't think you're arguing that it's terrible.
No,
or anything like that.
It's a perfectly serviceable episode.
Because even between those good moments, you've got this other thing I noticed: the spider droids start moving very early on, and you see them build over the course of the episode. They don't actually do anything until quite anything plot relevant until quite late. But them just being physically present does a lot to keep the tension higher and to hold your attention.
Something's
than if they
just happen.
That if they just waited to... And again, that's just very simple writing trick Russell T Davies does to, you know, for his lesser stories, keep you hooked even if the substance isn't quite there. And again, I do think that is a lot of people would look at that and say it's lazy or cheap writing. I think it's the opposite. I think it's just... I think it's knowing that this isn't one of your better stories, but still making it a fun time.
I was going to say, I don't think like Davies himself would make any pretense that this was sort of up there in his great, you know, episodes.
No,
I think he would fully admit to it being... Admit's maybe the wrong word, because I don't think it's anything bad, but you know, that it is sort of one of these not necessarily filler episodes, because it does serve a purpose in terms of setting up some of the things. And like I was saying earlier, I think there are some nice thematic things in terms of Rose seeing the Earth burn, and that being sort of the in for introducing the Doctor, you know, the Gallifrey having been destroyed in the Time War. That you can maybe, you know, one could maybe make the argument that helps the audience a little bit more kind of think about what that would be like for the Doctor. You know, you see the Earth burning, that you kind of get to go, oh yeah, what would that be like for your whole planet to burn? Whether the CG necessarily aids in making that feel a very real thing, maybe not, but equally, what do you do? I mean, you know.
So I thought, so there were definitely some moments of CG that were terrible, but for the most part,
pretty solid.
Yeah, it was good enough, I would say. I think solid is possibly too strong a word because it looks like 2005 TV budget CG.
Yes.
But one thing I did really like, I'm going to compliment the special effects on the whole, because this episode does a very good job. Like, it sounds silly, the amount of windows that are on platform 1, because it's obviously being filmed in just an indoor location, but the windows out into space, even if the effects aren't very good, do a really good job of helping you believe that you are on a space station where you very easily... like you could have had one shot of a window and then everything else is finished. And the lighting as well, I think it does a very good job of being like, there is a lot of light coming from this big window in the room. It all creates a very good illusion. And I think the costumes in this episode and the makeup
very good.
are absolutely excellent, especially given how many of them there are. I think that's top-notch work. That holds up to this day.
The practical work is very solid in terms of the costumes. Certainly, there is, I think, maybe one scene where in the big fan room where the Forest of Cheen person is twisting her neck, you can kind of see the creases in the prosthetics she's wearing. But I mean, that's a nit.
I didn't even notice that.
Well, I think because she's a sort of tree creature, it kind of it scans because it's like, oh, you could be kind of roots or sort of like it. It's not like, oh, there's really obvious creases in.
It's a small enough thing where it's like, well, I don't have a frame of reference for how this is supposed to look, so I can let it slide.
And it's like there's a certain there's always a critique. A kind of approach to critique that I see quite a lot that I think is a bit misguided, where people kind of critique both CG and practical effects on the grounds of, does this look completely and totally real to me? And it's like, well, it's not real.
I was about to say, there's already suspension of disbelief with any form of media. So
it's sort of like, are you buying into, it's almost a little bit like sort of watching a stand-up comedian tell a joke and then go, well, hold on, I don't think the base of that joke is true. And it's like, well, you're sort of buying into a certain fictitious reality. Obviously, it helps if it feels more real, and there's definitely... but I don't think in an episode like this, there's anything where, the little spider droid things... They don't look fantastic. They're very obviously CG, but there's no point where you're like, oh, this is really kicking me out of the story because I've realized they're not real spider droids.
And I think I mentioned this in the last episode. I think a lot of that is to do with the tone of the piece, because Russell T Davies sets a very campy, very silly tone. You can get away with much less realistic and convincing special effects and CGI particularly, because like we say, the practical effects are very, very good.
And I think actually you kind of see that. I mean, obviously we'll get on to Dalek later on, but in that they are very reserved with the amount of effects they use, and there's a lot of light. I mean, obviously you have the practical effect of the Dalek itself, but although I will, when we get onto Dalek, I will wax lyrical about the lighting, but we'll get there.
That episode's going to be 3 hours long.
But because that's a much more serious episode, it's like, we kind of rein in the effects a little bit and make sure we stick with things that we know will come across well. And I do think, like you say, in this episode where it's a bit sort of campier and everything, it does actually give you even then more free rein to be like, well, how far can we push effects that we know won't look totally convincing, but maybe put something, like the little spider robots, frankly, are themselves very camp. They've got these very sort of stretchy sort of legs that they're very sort of characterful. And even, the scene where the maintenance worker is comes across them in the vent, and they've got laser pointers on her. And
exactly, and also like she gets pulled into the vent.
It's like, how do they pull? Yeah,
exactly. And like something like that with her being pulled into the vent, is it realistic that the spiders would do that? No, but it accurately communicates in a very sort of totally
dangerous,
that they're dangerous, and that this person has just been killed by them.
And that, I think, contrasted with the big fans, is the kind of, for me, is the kind of like, yeah, that's not realistic, but I think it would be absurd to be like, oh, well, I'm kicked out of the plot by the spider robots dragging someone to a vent. Again, especially in the context of what is quite a campy episode. I mean, this episode in particular is very campy with Cassandra. I mean, she's and there's a lot of jokes, you know, with the iPod being a jukebox, and the classic Earth tunes of Toxic and
they do the joke of, you know, the ostrich had a wingspan of 500 meters and could breathe fire. And I love jokes like that, I'm not going to lie. Just the sort of people from the future massively misinterpreting the present day,
because it's sort of, you know, it's one of those fun things that's entertaining but also not completely, you know, I mean, maybe believing that the ostrich can breathe fire is not, but then again, you know, dinosaurs are a thing, and to be clear, I'm not suggesting that dinosaurs could breathe fire. I don't think that.
But who can say?
Who can really say? Have they done the studying necessary to rule out that possibility? No, I don't think so.
So I think nobody knows. So I'm going to say dinosaurs can breathe fire.
But yeah, it is a very campy episode, and I don't think it's. I think where I would place this episode is that it's perfectly serviceable. It's not hugely rewatchable because there's not a lot of substance in it, but there are some good scenes. It's kind of nice to see a bit of the exploration of like, well, what actually psychologically would it do to you to be plucked from where you are and you're suddenly now in the future?
If I can talk about that for a second, because that was one of the things that I loved most about this was, you know, it opens with a recap of episode 1 and then literally continues on from the final scene. And initially I felt that was odd because my memory of the episode is it's like, well, it doesn't really have anything to do with episode 1, but it actually really does. You see Rose go from being super energetic and excited to like, oh god, this is actually quite a lot, and suddenly having to grapple with these really big ideas around, like, firstly obviously meeting all the aliens, but then also just, you know, the whole planet's going to be destroyed and we're not here to save it. And things like that, and smaller things as well, like when she's talking to the sort of service woman, and she says, you have to give me permission, and Rose is clearly so uncomfortable with it. Exactly, and you know, because she's like a working class sort of girl, so that idea of being the higher up person, and like, it's, I know you mentioned earlier the character writing is good, but like, it's so characterful that instead of being like happy that, oh, someone, I can talk down to this person, or, you know, this person is revering me in a sense, she's really uncomfortable with it and just wants to make this person feel sort of welcome and like she's like they're on the same level.
And I think it is an interesting, I think Davies does a lot of this kind of relatively subtle's maybe the wrong word, because a lot of it is not that subtle, but this sort of relatively subtle kind of social commentary of that you do have, like Rose as being sort of a working class character, which in Doctor Who I mean, and obviously although the Doctor as a character is not meaningfully working class in any sense, in fact arguably is the aristocracy, but you can't really necessarily directly map the two, but Eccleston obviously is very much of that kind of working class identity background, and that's something that's quite different about New Who compared to Classic Who. Classic Who is very sort of, you know, yes, we're all the sort of very well spoken, you know, I mean, obviously you did have not necessarily always the case, but the companions are always generally in, I mean, take Sarah Jane for instance, being a journalist, which is obviously a well-respected profession compared to working in a shop.
I feel like this episode, possibly more than Rose, does a lot to subtextually separate this version of Doctor Who from old Doctor Who, both with what you've said, but also the thing that stood out to me was when Toxic started playing during that little action scene, and I just thought to myself, I bet classic Who fans hated this. And I bet you they were all just like, oh, Doctor Who's been commercialised and it's for plebs now, and
well, what you have to understand is that the only appropriate background music for any scene is kind of a weird synthy sting, and it just has to go.
Doesn't matter if Adrix just died, you know. And
I don't know why. I mean, I quite like classic Who incidental music, but certainly it's sort of quite consistent in some regards that it couldn't be. And yeah, like it's interesting to kind of use that in a way. Yeah, that is definitely different from classic Who. And I think it's interesting, though, as well, that it's still Doctor Who, fundamentally. Mm-hmm. It doesn't lose kind of a sense of Doctor Who as much as, you know, there is such a thing as a real essence of Doctor Who. It's obviously a very variable show in a lot of ways. But I think in the reboot, they did a good job of kind of balancing that, like, what do we need to change to make it actually watchable for new audiences, and what do we need to keep the thing. Having said that, obviously my first interaction with Doctor Who was the reboot, so a lot of my views of what Doctor Who is were largely shaped by Davies, so it's probably not that big of a surprise that when I watch Davies Who, I'm like, yes, this is Doctor Who.
No, definitely, but I think there are plenty of people who sort of grew up with Davies Who and now regard it as being the sort of, you know, like the hyper-commercialised, dumbed-down version of Doctor Who, which is fine, you know, everyone's allowed their opinions, of course, but I do.
Are they though?
Unless you think Chibnall good.
That's the
only rule.
No, we are the objective arbiters of all things Doctor Who, and if you disagree with us,
yes,
you're wrong
and stupid, and possibly also immoral.
Mainly immoral.
Yes.
You're a bad person fundamentally. Anyway,
what was I going to say? I was going to leap on with the whole character thing. The Doctor in this episode, just, my God, oozing personality. And you get a different angle of him. It's interesting. You see, in the first episode, he's somewhat aggressive and dismissive, and he's way more at home with all these aliens. Yeah. It's just a very characterful trait, and the way he's so blasé about things that Rose thinks should be a really big deal. Yeah. And obviously, you get the little bits about the Time War and stuff, and just Eccleston's playing him so well. Just the joy of him being on Platform 1. It's just, I loved it.
That was actually, that was something I wanted to mention as an interesting kind of character thing with the Doctor, where in this episode he is very, very quickly, I mean, literally from the outset of the episode, he very quickly settles into that dynamic of he really wants to impress Rose. Mm-hmm. He's really, you know, where he gives her the option of past, future, and whatever, and then she kind of gently ribs him of being like, oh, you think you're really impressive, and that gentle ribbing is enough for him to be like, right, okay, well, I'm going to show you how impressive, and not in like a condescending way, but he's just like really keen that he impress this person. And I do wonder whether I mean, this is getting a little hypothetical, but whether you could make an argument that sort of following the Time War, in which obviously there's a big question for him as whether he is a good person and all the rest of it. I mean, arguably a more subtle version of the early Capaldi arc of am I a good man, because it doesn't ever actually go am I a good man, but it's very clear that, you know, in like when he's like, you know, what matters is now, I'm the person I am now, and all the rest of it, that he is very keen to prove himself as an entertaining person, as an interesting person, as somebody who is worth hanging around with, and can show these things. And so it then is more, he gets carried away with that. It's like, right, we're going to go down, and he doesn't consider in the first instance the impact on Rose of taking her to the complete destruction of her home planet.
But also, I love how much of an impact it has on her. Like, I think what this episode has, and I've literally only just thought of this, it's kind of got a similar issue with the first episode, where the plot is just a framework for the character stuff. And I think the character stuff is, you've got Rose getting her first adventure, and you really see what does that mean for her specifically, and just for a person generally, because you've got specific instances, and then you've got broader stuff when she laments that the Earth got destroyed and no one saw it, and stuff like that. And you've obviously got all the stuff with the Doctor. So I think that's possibly why you do have contrivances like the giant fans and stuff like that, because it's clearly character first in that sense. And I love that. So I really feel bad when I contrast with Chibnall stories. But do you remember the Ghost Monument, the second episode, which is those characters, their first step off an alien planet, and JXE talks about this in the 5 Hour Doctor Who. All they do is go, we're on an alien planet now. We're on an alien planet. Rose is full on, just like, I mean, she has those are aliens, but it's she's like, very... oh my god, like this is like the planet is about to die. All of my people who like me are gone. Like when she phones her mum and she's like, my mum's dead.
Yes,
and I'm like, oh my god, and it's just. It's so human, and so like it's really emotional at parts. Like I got really quite sad when Rose was talking about how the Earth got destroyed and no one was looking, and you really do. Like, I think it's an important piece of character development that she has that first episode of being thrown out into the universe and it being a really big deal for her.
Yeah.
Even though plot-wise, she contributes literally nothing to the
she's
story.
Just there.
Exactly. But I think it's so important for her overall development, and it's something that is, as we've seen, so easily missed, and the show suffers when it doesn't do that.
I mean, two things on that. There's the dialogue when you mention like that, where she goes like, the aliens are so alien. I think that's a great example of an approach to dialogue, because she goes like, the aliens are so alien. I mean, obviously they're aliens, but you look at them and they're so alien, or something to that effect. And I think that's a great example of dialogue, a style of dialogue that isn't used as much as it should be, in my view, because it doesn't really, on the face of it, doesn't really make sense. I mean, she even kind of acknowledges that it doesn't make sense in the dialogue, that, like, obviously the aliens are alien. But it's the exact kind of dialogue that real people say. It's not... sort of Sorkin-esque dialogue of like, everyone's got the perfect witty thing to say. She is just processing this thing of like, oh, they are actual aliens, and the only way she can describe that is the aliens are alien, because like, how else do you that's what an alien is. It is inherently that thing that is so different that you struggle to kind of process it. The second point, if I can remember it, was to do with something you said, but I can't remember what it was. So
I have a thing to talk off what you just said. The word you used there, like it's how people talk, it's very human. I think that was what struck me about this episode, was just how human it was, and how... I mean, I suppose in a sense it's not really a surprise, because it's Russell T Davies' like whole thing, but just how much humanity and how many little moments of... I truly believed Rose was a normal person who is on an alien space station and meeting aliens for the first time, And I think that's part of the firstly, that draws you into the character, which is very important for the rest of the season, but I think it's also part of the overall immersion of the episode, and why the plot issues like the fans and the levers and the yada yada didn't bother me, because I was so just invested because of those moments sort of sprinkled throughout it. I think it's a real strength of the episode. Like I said, I don't think it's the best episode. I don't think it's great. But I think there are some really good moments in there overall.
Yeah, I think largely, like you say, in the first episode, where it's not really about the autons, it's about introducing certain themes. I think where I feel there is a difference in this episode, and I think what kind of pushes it down to not one I would necessarily rewatch that often for me, is I'm not sure the two quite gel quite as well as they do in the first episode. If I do feel there's a bit more of a sense of like, okay, here's the scene, we're in this room now, here's the character bit, and now we're going to run off and do the running through the fans and thing. There's a little bit less integration. They're still broadly pretty integrated. It's still a perfectly serviceable story. It's not bad by any means. And I think from the kind of series perspective, as a second episode, it works.
I see what you mean. It's kind of, and I agree, it's kind of structurally the same as Rose, but it's sort of less good in that sense. It doesn't do as well with the separation of plot and character. I think the only other thing I want to mention very quickly is just I want to talk about Cassandra as a character. Just because I think she, like her and the Forest of Cheam lady, they get a lot of character across just through some very small bits of dialogue and some very select choice of words. Like the thing that stood out to me with Cassandra is when she gets caught and she mocks the doctor for being like the lonely boy in school, and it's like, I bet you never got kissed. It's like so much character just oozing from that. And
like I said earlier, I don't think it's a surprise that Cassandra is one of those characters that ends up getting brought back only a season later. I mean, to be fair, I don't think she's probably the sort of character that you could bring back more than a season later. She's a great character, but she's not like a. I mean, it'd be weird if she was in the 60th.
At this rate,
Cassandra has been spotted on set in the 60th. But she does have. You absolutely get what kind of person she is. And she has that dialogue that is very, again, I mean, kind of like we said in the last episode, she has dialogue that you could not give to another character, and it makes sense for them to be saying it.
Exactly. And I do, I think I do want to mention actually one of my, in a sense, this is a big criticism. I mean, it's only one scene, but it's a scene I've really had some problems with. It's when Rose is talking to Cassandra.
I don't like that scene.
Yeah, because it's like. So Cassandra, I mean, so Russell T Davies has said that Cassandra is a commentary on essentially women starving themselves on the red carpet and horrible, abusive beauty trends, which even if, I didn't know that for certain, absolutely comes across with her character. And that's a very interesting point to make, and I think Cassandra is a good sort of exaggeration of that concept, but Rose attacks Cassandra for it, which I think is very, I mean, it kind of makes sense in the story because Cassandra is a horrible person and the unambiguous villain, but given what Cassandra represents, I don't think that's the right angle to be attacking, and to say that women who have had surgery aren't human anymore. Again, I do think there is a huge problem with women feeling the need to have surgery and stuff like that, or I expect anyone, but obviously it's a problem that primarily affects women. But Rose is, I mean, maybe it's not meant to be read that Rose is the hero of that scene. Maybe that's just her character. But I did interpret it as this is Russell T Davies talking, just
being like, you're bad people. I mean, I'd kind of forgotten somehow that scene, because when I watched it, I was like, I don't like that scene at all. For those reasons, and also just Rose just kind of comes across as mean-spirited rather than having kind of a... It does sort of feel just a bit like, let's just move Rose over next to Cassandra, have her say some kind of nasty stuff to Cassandra, and then leave. And it's like, well, what was the point of that? I feel like it didn't develop either of their characters particularly. And yeah, in the broader context of like...
of what Cassandra represents.
And also there was... I feel like in that moment in particular, Cassandra kind of gets a bit confused as a metaphor, because it's like she starts talking in this way where I think, you know, when she starts talking about being a pure human, that's a bit fashy, you know, like, and so it's sort of like, well, is she, and, you know, like, to be clear, obviously a thing can be a metaphor for more than one thing, but it's a bit like, in the context of her representing arguably some of these sort of kind of fascistic ideas about, you know, purity and the ideal human and things like that, which obviously there is a certain amount of intersection with that in sort of constrictive beauty standards and everything, in that is tied up quite a lot in the ideal vision of a person. But for Rose to kind of be like, I'd rather die than look like you, and it's like...
I think you mentioning fascism actually caused me to kind of reconsider that a bit. I think because Cassandra, you know, she talks about being pure and all that, like, she's very bitchy, very very right wing, let's be honest, and you know, she's very capitalist as well. The whole thing is about money. So I think Rusty Davies is clearly criticising those things with her character, but he's pairing them with the looking good thing. So I think in his mind, like, women spending loads of money and having lots of surgery to look good is a vanity thing, that's just like, you know, they do it just because, like, they're so self-obsessed about themselves,
rather than
which is possibly a product of the time, possibly a product of it being 2005. Nowadays I understand it to much more be these women are predominantly victims of a society that puts so much pressure on them to look a certain way.
Would, I think, be a much more interesting critique. And I think it's basically, I don't think it's a problem to have Cassandra be the character that she is in this episode absent that scene, almost, because that scene really kind of drives home, like, oh, we're criticizing something here, rather than it being like, oh, she's just kind of an unpleasant kind of vain character, because obviously you can have a vain character, but yeah, I feel like kind of couching that in like, oh, vain people are sort of almost fascists. It's a bit, I mean, maybe that's going a bit far, but there's a hint of that.
The subtext is there, you know, and it's so I don't think that's an entirely, like, outrageous sort of interpretation.
Whether, you know, whether Davies intended it to be that or not is another thing, but I think that is a way that it can come across, and I don't think, like you said, I don't think it's a wildly unreasonable interpretation of it, and given that it doesn't, to my mind, really serve plot or character development, I think you could cut that scene and the episode would arguably be better for it, and I don't think you'd have to replace it with anything, because it doesn't interact with the rest of the story.
No, it really doesn't. It does also sort of just spring off the Cassandra thing, and this is the last thing I want to mention. The anti-capitalist messaging in this episode it's so embedded in it. Literally from the beginning, the Doctor is talking about money, how the Earth is being let to die because it's not the funds have gone and it's not profitable anymore. Cassandra's whole motivation is money, and it's all about how, like, people's lives are just, you know, like, she'll happily sacrifice them to make money and stuff like that. I mean, I know we joke about this, we joked about it during the episode. All the fuckwits who talk about Doctor Who is so left-wing now, I liked it before it was political. It's just shut up.
It is an absurd thing, because it's, I mean, by and large, I would characterise this as the dog is just being let out. So if you want to know... This is a terrible joke. If you want to know who let the dogs out, but yeah, I mean, by all accounts, broadly speaking, it's a very tame critique of capitalism. But I'm going to myself engage in a small amount of chibnall bashing now, but compared to the apparently hyper-political
super left wing,
take is absurd, because there's nothing even this tame in the Chibnall era of Who.
I mean, Chibnall has Kablam, which is straight up just the pro-capitalist. But Christ, we'll get to it.
This series is just going to be charting our slow decline into sort of depression about the state of.
I look forward to it. But I just thought that was interesting because it is literally baked into the identity of the episode, and it's not subtle.
No,
and it is explicitly anti-capitalist.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's the thing. Is it's a relatively tame critique in that it doesn't have a huge amount of depth to it, but it's certainly not subtle.
Yeah, it's explicit. It is a pure capitalism bad.
And even like you say from the outset, where the Doctor's like, we're the great and the good, by which I mean the very rich. There's obviously this very clear implication that those are two different things,
Yes.
It is, you don't get here by actually being a good person, you get here by being very wealthy, which is the opposite of being a good person. Which on that vague sort of anti-capitalist rant,
I've said everything I want to say about it. Good. I definitely enjoyed it. Probably wouldn't rewatch it, and it's a step down, but still plenty good fun and strong character work as always.
I think I pretty much agree with you. I think the only disagreement is how much of a step down. I think it's a bit more of a step down than perhaps you do, but broadly it serves a purpose within the series. It's certainly not a high point of the series, but it's not by any means a bad episode. I think it's perfectly serviceable. So then next episode is the Charles Dickens one. The Unquiet Dead. Yes. Aaron will remember the names of episodes more often than I do. So next time is Unquiet Dead, and see you then.